Jonathan Carter, the powerful CEO of Nova Airlines, walked onto his own flight, but no one knew who he was. Disguised as an ordinary passenger, he expected to observe minor flaws in customer service. Instead, he saw the ugly truth. Flight attendants mocking economy travelers, ignoring struggling passengers, and treating first class like royalty, until one crew member pushed him too far. When a flight attendant humiliated him mid-flight, assuming he was just another unimportant passenger, she had no idea who she was talking to. But when Jonathan stood up and revealed his true identity, the entire cabin went silent. What happened next shook the airline to its core. Before we take off, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. Jonathan. Carter adjusted his baseball cap and stepped into the bustling airport terminal, blending seamlessly into the crowd. Dressed in worn jeans, a plain button-up, and scuffed sneakers, he looked like any other business traveler catching a routine flight. No one gave him a second glance, which was exactly what he wanted. As the CEO of Nova Airlines, Jonathan had spent years refining his company's image. Sleek branding, premium-class luxury, and top-tier service. But lately, customer complaints had piled up about a growing divide between economy and first-class treatment. His board members brushed it off, attributing the complaints to entitled travelers or isolated incidents. Jonathan wasn't convinced, so he decided to see the truth for himself. He had booked an economy ticket under a false name, skipping VIP privileges and corporate escorts. No one at Nova knew their boss was about to walk through their doors. As an anonymous passenger, no priority check-in, no special treatment. Just him and his airline, as seen from the bottom. As he approached the check-in counter, a woman in a sleek navy uniform barely glanced up. "Next," she muttered, tapping aggressively on her keyboard. Jonathan stepped forward and slid his ID across the counter. The woman, her name tag read Rebecca, snatched it up and exhaled sharply, like the simple act of assisting him was an unbearable inconvenience. "Flying economy to Los Angeles?" she asked, her tone clipped. "That's right," he replied, keeping his voice even. She punched in a few keys and frowned. "You didn't pre-select a seat. Looks like you got stuck in the back. Full flight today." Jonathan nodded. "No problem. I was actually hoping to check if any aisle seats were open," Rebecca scoffed, barely hiding her irritation. "Economy doesn't get to pick whatever they want last minute." Then, as if remembering she was supposed to pretend to be polite, she forced a tight-lipped smile. "You'll have to take what you're given." Jonathan glanced over at the adjacent counter where a well-dressed man in a tailored suit was checking in for first class. The agent there was practically beaming, scrolling through available seat options and asking if he preferred extra legroom or a more private cabin experience. Jonathan turned back to Rebecca. "Are you sure? It looks like..." "Sir, you're holding up the line," she cut in, already reaching for the next passenger's boarding pass. Jonathan exhaled and grabbed his ticket. "This is going to be interesting." He made his way to security, where he saw more of the same. First-class passengers were ushered into priority lanes with minimal screening, while economy travelers stood in long, winding lines, forced to shuffle through like cattle. A woman in front of him, a young mother with a toddler, struggled to remove her shoes while balancing her child. No one helped her. By the time Jonathan reached the gate, he was already seeing a pattern. The airline he built, the one that prided itself on world-class service, had a clear divide, and if this was happening on the ground, he could only imagine what awaited him once he stepped onto the plane. Jonathan approached the boarding gate, where the usual pre-flight chaos was unfolding. Passengers crowded the seating area, clutching their tickets, waiting for their turn to board. The announcement over the speakers was clear. "First class and elite members, you may board at this time." He leaned against a pillar and watched. A red-carpeted lane led directly to the jet bridge, where airline staff stood, offering warm smiles and effortless hospitality to those with first-class tickets. A well-dressed businessman strolled past, barely slowing down as an attendant greeted him with a bright, Welcome aboard, Mr. Calloway. We're delighted to have you flying with us today. Now boarding families with young children and passengers requiring assistance. A handful of parents and elderly passengers shuffled forward, some of them visibly hesitant, as if expecting to be hurried along. A mother pushing a stroller struggled to fold it up while keeping hold of her toddler's hand. A gate agent sighed and finally stepped in, handling the stroller with visible impatience rather than assistance. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. Then came the third call, now boarding zone 1, the first rows of economy. The passengers stood, many clutching their carry-ons tightly as they filed in. The staff at the gate had lost their previous warmth, scanning tickets without much enthusiasm. The energy had shifted. The enthusiasm reserved for first-class guests was gone. Finally, his turn came. Jonathan handed his ticket to the gate agent, a young woman with sharp eyes who barely glanced at him before scanning it. She paused, then frowned. "Mr. Carter?" His heart gave a slight jolt. Had he been recognized? But the woman wasn't looking at him. Instead, she was staring at his seat assignment. "You're in Zone 5, Jonathan nodded. "Yep." Her lips thinned. "You should wait until your zone is called." He blinked, glancing around. The gate was practically empty now, most passengers already boarded. A few other economy passengers were walking through. He gestured toward them. "Looks like others are going in now." The woman let out a sharp breath, her impatience showing. "They were called before you. Please wait until it's your turn." Jonathan wasn't about to cause a scene, so he stepped aside. He had barely moved when another man, dressed in a sleek blazer, walked up and handed over his ticket. The same agent who had just sent Jonathan away smiled. "Of course, sir. Right this way." Jonathan watched as the man, another first-class passenger, was waved through despite his zone not being called yet. Something simmered in Jonathan's chest, not anger, but a sharp awareness that the biases weren't just in his head. When Zone 5 was finally called, he stepped forward again, handing over his ticket without a word. The agent barely acknowledged him as he walked onto the jet bridge. He was about to see exactly how deep this culture ran. Stepping onto the plane, Jonathan immediately felt the shift in atmosphere. The first-class cabin was a world of its own. Plush, leather seats, warm lighting, and attendants moving gracefully between passengers, offering pre-flight champagne. Soft music played overhead, creating a tranquil environment that barely resembled the chaos at the gate. "Mr. Calloway, would you like a hot towel before takeoff?" Jonathan overheard an attendant say, as she knelt slightly to offer the businessman from earlier a neatly folded cloth. He kept walking. As he moved toward the economy section, the air itself seemed different. The narrow aisle was already congested, with passengers struggling to stow their luggage while attendants stood by, offering little assistance. The warm hospitality of first class had disappeared. Instead, the crew looked impatient, their movements curt and robotic. Jonathan glanced at his ticket, row 28, seat C. He started down the aisle, sidestepping a father trying to fit a suitcase into the overhead bin, while his young daughter clutched his leg. Nearby, an elderly woman with a cane stood awkwardly, waiting for someone to help her with her carry-on. Then came the voice, "Sir, you need to keep moving." Jonathan turned. A flight attendant stood a few rows ahead, arms crossed. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. "Lisa Harper, according to her name tag. I'm just waiting for her to—" "People need to get to their seats," Lisa interrupted, nodding toward the line forming behind him. Her tone was clipped, borderline dismissive, as if he were a nuisance. Rather than a paying customer, Jonathan bit back a retort and moved forward, sliding into his seat. A minute later, the elderly woman was still struggling to get her bag into the overhead compartment. Jonathan stood again, reaching up to help. "Sir, please take your seat." Lisa's voice rang out immediately. "We'll handle it." She cut him off, already turning away. But she didn't handle it. She walked off without a second glance. Jonathan helped anyway, ignoring the brief stares from passengers around him. The woman thanked him softly before settling into her seat. A few rows ahead, a man in a tailored suit stood to place his own bag overhead. Jonathan watched as a different flight attendant immediately stepped in to assist, giving him a polite smile as she adjusted the bag for him. Jonathan leaned back into his seat. 2 passengers, same airline, completely different treatment. Lisa returned this time with another flight attendant in tow, her eyes scanning the rows like she was already irritated. She asked a couple in the row ahead of him. Her voice was noticeably warmer. The woman in first class had received a smile, but Jonathan, he had gotten orders. Jonathan didn't say anything. Not yet. He wanted to see how far this would go. The plane hummed with the low murmur of passengers settling in, the occasional clink of overhead bins shutting, and the routine announcements from the cockpit. Jonathan remained silent, his hands resting on his lap as he observed everything. The interactions, the tones, the subtle but undeniable differences in how people were treated. As the flight attendants made their final rounds before takeoff, Lisa reappeared, scanning the cabin with the same sharp, almost impatient expression she had worn before. She barely looked at the economy passengers, her focus darting toward the first-class section as if that were where her real job mattered. Across the aisle, an elderly woman, a frail figure with a soft, kind face, struggled to buckle her seatbelt. Her fingers trembled as she fought with the latch. Jonathan instinctively reached over. "Here, let me help you," he offered, gently clicking the belt into place. Before the woman could even thank him, Lisa was there. "Sir," she said sharply, "passengers are expected to secure their own seatbelts." Jonathan turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze. Her voice carried no warmth, no patience, just irritation. She was having trouble, he replied evenly. Lisa exhaled, clearly unconcerned. If she needs assistance, she should have requested pre-boarding. Jonathan glanced at the elderly woman, who was now looking down, embarrassed. Before he could respond, the sound of laughter erupted from a few rows ahead. 2 flight attendants were standing near the first-class divider, engaged in a hushed conversation. They were smiling, giggling under their breath, and throwing casual glances toward economy. Jonathan sharpened his focus. "You should have heard him whining," one of them whispered. "Dude was mad he didn't get a free upgrade. Economy passengers always think they're entitled to first-class treatment." The other one smirked. "They have no idea how we handle their complaints. We just nod and delete them later." Jonathan felt a slow burn in his chest. Lisa noticed his gaze lingering on them. She frowned. "Something wrong, sir?" Jonathan's expression remained neutral, just listening. Lisa hesitated for a fraction of a second before shifting her weight, arms crossing. "If you have a concern, you can submit it to customer service after the flight." Jonathan almost laughed. Customer service? He knew exactly where those complaints went. Buried under automated responses and carefully worded apologies with no real action. Before he could say anything, a different interaction caught his attention. A first-class passenger stood up, effortlessly, slipping into the aisle. The moment he reached for his bag, a flight attendant rushed to assist him, smiling warmly. Jonathan's stomach tightened. 2 passengers, 2 situations, 2 vastly different reactions. He leaned back in his seat, fingers steepled together. Lisa had no idea who she was talking to, but she was about to find out. The plane cruised smoothly at 30,000 feet, and the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Jonathan remained in his seat, watching, waiting. He had already seen more than enough. The stark contrast between first-class treatment and economy neglect was undeniable, but he wanted to push it further, to see just how deep this culture of favoritism ran. Meal service began, and flight attendants moved swiftly through the aisles, handing out trays of prepackaged food. In first class, he noticed the experience was different. Freshly plated meals, wine poured tableside, and customized options. Lisa made her way down the aisle, a tray balanced in her hands. When she reached Jonathan's row, she barely spared him a glance as she set his meal down. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked, monotone. "Do you have any other options?" Jonathan asked. Lisa sighed, visibly irritated. "Sir, it's chicken or pasta. That's all economy gets." Jonathan remained calm. "I have an allergy to certain ingredients. Is there a way to check what's in these meals?" Lisa rolled her eyes. We can't accommodate every little request down here. If you have dietary restrictions, you should have booked a first-class ticket where we offer custom meals. Jonathan held her gaze. So, people in economy don't deserve to eat safely. Lisa shifted, glancing at the passengers around them who were now listening. She forced a tight smile. I didn't say that, sir, but we have policies in place. If you don't want the meal, you don't have to take it. Jonathan didn't respond. Instead, he reached over and grabbed a tray of chicken. 2 rows ahead, a first-class passenger snapped his fingers, calling over another attendant. I don't really like either option. Immediately nodded. Have something else? Of course, Mr. Calloway. Let me check with the kitchen and see what we can prepare for you. Jonathan watched as the attendant hurried off to accommodate the request. He turned back to Lisa. So, first class gets custom meals, but economy can deal with whatever they're handed. Lisa's expression darkened. Sir, I need to continue my service. Jonathan leaned back. Go ahead. She walked off without another word. As Jonathan opened the plastic lid of his meal, he couldn't shake the growing realization this wasn't just bad service. This was a culture problem. The bias was ingrained, habitual. The crew wasn't even thinking about it anymore. To them, it was normal. Passengers in economy weren't people. They were problems to manage. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay patient. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to observe, but his patience wouldn't last much longer. Lisa and her crew were about to make one final mistake, and when they did, he wouldn't stay silent. The meal service had ended, and the cabin settled into a quiet lull. Some passengers dozed off, others scrolled through their phones or flipped through in-flight magazines. The hum of the engines filled the space, masking the occasional clink of glasses and hushed conversation from first class. Jonathan had remained, quiet, watching, waiting for the moment that would push things too far. He didn't have to wait long. A few rows ahead, a young mother was struggling with her baby. The infant had been fussy for a while, whimpering softly at first, before escalating into tired cries. The mother, a woman in her late 20s, looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, hands trembling slightly as she rocked her child. Jonathan noticed it immediately, the shift in the flight attendant's demeanor. Lisa passed by with an irritated glance, her lips pressing into a tight line. She didn't stop to offer assistance, didn't check in to see if the woman needed anything. Instead, she rolled her eyes and kept walking. Another flight attendant murmured under her breath to a colleague near the first-class curtain, loud enough for Jonathan to hear. Why do people insist on bringing babies on flights? It's not our problem if she can't handle it. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Then came the final straw. Lisa returned, standing in the aisle with her arms crossed. "Ma'am," she said curtly, "you need to keep your baby quiet. Other passengers are trying to relax." The mother looked up, humiliated, shifting the baby in her arms. I'm trying," she said softly. "She's just overtired. I'll get her to sleep soon." Lisa didn't soften. If anything, her expression hardened. "Maybe next time you should consider staying home if you can't control your child." The silence that followed was suffocating. Passengers turned, some watching with discomfort, others pretending not to hear. No one said anything. Jonathan's patience snapped. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. "That's enough!" Lisa blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, please sit down." "No." Jonathan's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "That is not how you speak to a paying customer, let alone a struggling mother." Lisa stiffened. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." "It does now," Jonathan said flatly. Lisa scoffed, shaking her head. "If you have a complaint, you can submit it to—" Jonathan exhaled sharply. That was it. That was the moment. He slowly reached up, adjusting his baseball cap, then took it off entirely. Every eye was on him now. The energy in the cabin shifted. Jonathan straightened, his voice clear, unwavering. "You should probably know who I am before you say another word." Lisa blinked, her face pale. "What? My name is Jonathan Carter." He paused for effect, letting it sink in. "I own this airline." The silence was deafening. The cabin went completely silent. Lisa stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, her hands gripping the drink tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. The color drained from her face, as the weight of Jonathan's words settled over her like a suffocating fog. Passengers who had been pretending not to watch suddenly sat up straighter, eyes darting between Jonathan and the stunned flight attendant. The mother, still cradling her crying baby, stared in wide-eyed shock. Jonathan didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the balance of power in the room. Lisa finally found her voice. "You're what?" "I own this airline," Jonathan repeated, his voice even but sharp. "And I've been sitting in economy, watching, listening, and experiencing the way my passengers are treated." His gaze didn't waver. "You have no idea how much you've just revealed about this airline's culture." Lisa's lips parted, but no words came out. One of the other flight attendants, the one who had been laughing at complaints earlier, took a small step back, her eyes darting toward the first-class curtain as if contemplating running. His patience stretched to its limit. "Let me ask you something, Lisa. If I had been wearing a suit and sitting in first class, would you have spoken to me that way?" Lisa flinched. She didn't answer. "Would you have rolled your eyes at me? Ignored me? Belittled me?" Jonathan's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "Would you have treated me like I was beneath you?" Lisa swallowed, visibly struggling. I didn't know who you were." Jonathan's expression hardened. "That's the problem. It shouldn't matter who I am. Every passenger deserves respect. Every single one." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers nodded in agreement. Others whispered among themselves. Even those who had stayed silent before now watched with something close to satisfaction. Lisa opened her mouth, then closed it, her eyes darting around as if looking for a way out. Jonathan leaned slightly forward, his tone quieter now but no less powerful. "Tell me, Lisa, how many other passengers have you dismissed? How many complaints have you ignored? How many people have you treated like they didn't matter?" Lisa's breath hitched. "You thought I was just another economy passenger," Jonathan continued. "Someone whose voice didn't carry weight, someone who didn't matter." He let the words hang in the air for a moment. "Well, guess what? They all matter. Every single one." Lisa's face was bright red now, her breathing uneven. Jonathan straightened, letting his gaze sweep over the entire economy cabin. "This flight has made something very clear to me. Sky Nova Airlines has a problem with culture, a problem with bias, and it ends today." Lisa's hands trembled as she realized there was no coming back from this. Lisa's face had drained of all color, her hands gripping the tray like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, a mix of shock, quiet satisfaction, and disbelief. No one had expected this. The man they had seen dismissed, spoken down to, and ignored. He was the one in charge of the entire airline. Jonathan let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle over everyone. Then he took a slow step forward, keeping his eyes locked on Lisa's. "You had a choice," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You could have shown kindness, empathy, a little bit of patience." He glanced at the young mother, still holding her. "Baby," now rocking her a little more gently as she looked between them. "But you didn't." Lisa opened her mouth, struggling for words. I didn't mean you did," Jonathan interrupted. "And that's the problem. You didn't hesitate. You didn't think twice. It was natural, automatic." He shook his head, slightly. "Which means this isn't just about you. This is about the entire system." One of the other flight attendants, the one who had been laughing earlier, took a step back, trying to disappear. Jonathan turned his gaze to her, letting her feel the full weight of his scrutiny. "How many times have you ignored a complaint?" he asked, his voice dropping just enough to make it sharper. "How many times have you treated economy passengers like they didn't matter?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The guilt on her face said everything. Lisa tried to steady herself. "Sir, if I had known who you were, I never would have—" "Exactly," Jonathan cut in. "But you shouldn't. Treat people with respect because of who they are. You should treat them with respect because it's the right thing to do." A few passengers clapped softly, breaking the tension. It wasn't a dramatic, slow clap moment. It was quiet, understated, a show of support, agreement. Lisa blinked rapidly, looking around as if just now realizing how many people had witnessed. her humiliation. Her shoulders slumped slightly. Jonathan exhaled slowly. He wasn't here to destroy her career. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here to make things right. "I'm not going to fire you," he said finally. Lisa's eyes snapped to his, wide with disbelief. "But I am going to hold you accountable," Jonathan continued. "You and every single person on this crew." A few of the other flight attendants shifted, uncomfortably. "When we land, we're going to have a long conversation about the future of this airline," Jonathan said. His gaze swept over the entire cabin. "Because this stops today." Lisa nodded stiffly, swallowing hard. Jonathan finally sat back down, exhaling. The plane was still thousands of feet in the air, but the real turbulence had only just begun. The tension in the cabin hung thick in the air, pressing down on everyone. As Jonathan settled back into his seat, no one spoke, no one dared to. Lisa stood motionless, her hands still gripping the drink tray, her face unreadable. The other flight attendants hovered awkwardly near the galley, avoiding eye contact. Their earliest cradling her baby turned to Jonathan. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. Jonathan gave her a small nod, but his mind was already elsewhere. This wasn't about one flight. It wasn't about one rude flight attendant. It was about a culture, a toxic, ingrained mindset that had festered for far too long. Lisa finally moved, turning stiffly toward the galley without another word. Jonathan could tell she wanted to disappear, to pretend this never happened, but she had no choice now. She had been seen. Passengers were still watching, their eyes darting between Jonathan and the crew. Some of them wore satisfied expressions, as if justice had finally been served. Others looked stunned, as if they couldn't quite believe what they had just witnessed. Jonathan leaned back, exhaling. This was just the beginning. A few minutes later, the flight attendants resumed their service, but everything felt different. The energy had shifted, the forced smiles, the empty pleasantries, they were gone. For the first time, the crew looked nervous. Jonathan had no interest in humiliating anyone further, but he wasn't going to let this moment pass without action. He reached into the seatback pocket, pulled out a notepad, and began writing. A list of immediate changes, secret shopper evaluations. Executives would fly undercover on random flights, just like he had today. No one would know who they were. Customer complaints would no longer be ignored. Every report would be reviewed by a dedicated team. Mandatory training for all flight attendants and staff. Not just customer service, but real, in-depth training. On bias, empathy, and professionalism. Stronger leadership accountability. If a crew was consistently reported for poor service, the issue wouldn't stop at the attendants. Management would be held responsible. The list kept growing. Jonathan had built this airline from the ground up, and he had assumed his employees carried the same values he did. He had been wrong. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Carter," Jonathan looked up. One of the flight attendants, a younger woman who had been quiet during the entire ordeal, stood hesitantly beside him. She looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with the hem of her uniform. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for all of it." Jonathan studied her for a moment, then gave a single nod. "Then be part of the change," he said simply. She swallowed, then nodded back. "I will." Jonathan turned his gaze toward the window, watching the clouds roll past. When they landed, everything was going to be different. The wheels touched down with a smooth jolt, the familiar sensation of landing rippling through the cabin. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed off, and passengers instinctively reached for their belongings, stretching after the long flight. But unlike most landings, this one was charged with something else, a quiet tension that had yet to fade. Lisa and the other flight attendants had been eerily silent for the remainder of the flight, their usual authoritative presence diminished. Jonathan remained seated, arms crossed, watching as passengers exchanged knowing glances. Word had spread throughout the plane. The man in seat 28C wasn't just another economy traveler. He was the CEO. The moment the jet bridge connected, Lisa turned toward Jonathan, her voice hesitant. "Mr. Carter, would you like to deplane first? The irony wasn't lost on him. Now, suddenly, he was a priority. "No," Jonathan said simply. "I'll wait." Lisa nodded stiffly and stepped aside. Passengers began filing out, some throwing him lingering glances, others murmuring their thanks as they passed. The young mother, still holding her now sleeping baby, paused just long enough to meet his eyes. "You didn't have to step in," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," Jonathan replied. She gave him a grateful smile before disappearing into the aisle. Only when the last passenger had stepped off did Jonathan finally stand, grabbing his bag from the overhead compartment. He moved past Lisa and the rest of the crew, pausing just before stepping off the plane. "I expect to see all of you at corporate tomorrow," he said without looking back. "We have a lot to talk about." No one dared to argue. As Jonathan stepped into the terminal, his assistant Mark was already waiting for him near the gate. The moment he saw him, Mark's eyes widened. "Sir, we didn't expect you back so soon. Walk with me," Jonathan said, striding toward the exit. Mark scrambled to keep up. "How was the flight?" Mark asked cautiously. Jonathan handed him the folded notepad. "We have a serious problem." Mark flipped through the list, his expression tightening with each point. "This is bad. This is worse than bad," Jonathan corrected. "It's systemic. It's not one or two bad employees. It's the culture. And if we don't fix it, we're going to lose this airline." Mark nodded quickly. Pushed open the doors to the executive parking lot. The city skyline loomed ahead, the weight of responsibility settling over him. "We start at the top," he said firmly. "Emergency meeting tomorrow. Leadership, training, customer advocacy, the works. We're about to rebuild this company from the inside out." Mark exhaled, already pulling out his phone to make calls. Jonathan looked back at the terminal one last time, then stepped into his car. Sky Nova Airlines was about to change, and it all started with one flight. The conference room at Sky Nova's headquarters was silent, the tension palpable. Every executive, department head, and senior manager sat stiffly in their chairs, waiting. Some shuffled papers, others checked their watches, but no one spoke. Then the door opened. Jonathan walked in, his expression unreadable, a thick file tucked under his arm. He took his seat at the head of the long, polished table, setting the file down with a deliberate thud. "Let's get straight to the point," he said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Sky Nova has a culture problem, and it's our fault." No one dared to interrupt. Jonathan glanced around the room. "I just flew economy on one of our flights," he continued. "I wasn't treated like a valued customer. I wasn't treated like a guest. I was treated like an inconvenience. And if that's happening to me, what do you think is happening to everyone else?" The silence stretched. Some executives shifted uncomfortably, while others avoided eye contact. Jonathan didn't let them off the hook. He pulled out his notepad, flipping it open. The divide between first class and economy isn't just about legroom or better food. It's about respect. And from what I saw, we're failing half of our passengers before they even step on board. Few people nodded, but no one spoke. Jonathan leaned forward. "I want solutions, not excuses." One of the department heads cleared his throat. "Sir, we've always positioned Sky Nova as a premium airline. Our first-class service is what sets us apart. And what about the people who can't afford first class?" Jonathan cut in. "Are we telling them they don't matter?" The man swallowed hard. Jonathan continued. "I watched my crew mock passengers. I saw complaints ignored. I saw a flight attendant humiliate a mother for having a crying baby. And I saw firsthand that our employees have no accountability. That changes today." A woman from the HR department hesitated before speaking. "What exactly are you proposing, sir?" Jonathan flipped another page in his notepad. "First, mandatory empathy and bias training for all employees. No exceptions. Second, random undercover flights by senior staff, myself included. If anyone thinks they can put on a show when they know corporate is watching, they'll have to rethink that strategy." He looked around the room, letting it sink in. Third, a direct line for passenger complaints that actually gets reviewed. Not ignored, not deleted, reviewed. And finally, leadership accountability. If a crew has consistent reports of poor service, their managers will answer for it. The executives exchanged glances. Some nodded, Others looked skeptical. Jonathan sat. "Oh, back. This isn't optional. Sky Nova is changing, effective immediately. Either you're part of the solution or you're part of the problem." The room was dead quiet. Then slowly, one by one, people nodded. Jonathan exhaled. The real work was about to begin. Months later, Jonathan sat in seat 14A, staring out at the tarmac as the plane prepared for takeoff. This time, he wasn't in disguise. No baseball cap, no fake name, just himself, a CEO sitting in economy, observing the changes that had unfolded since his last flight. The airline had changed, but not overnight. The transition had been slow, met with resistance from some employees, pushback from upper management, and skepticism from passengers who had grown used to poor treatment. But Jonathan had been relentless. The new policies had taken effect immediately. Undercover corporate flights, real consequences for poor service. A complete overhaul of training programs, and most importantly, a shift in mindset. The culture was changing. A flight attendant moved down the aisle, stopping beside an elderly woman struggling with her seatbelt. Jonathan watched closely, waiting. "Here, ma'am, let me help you," the attendant said with genuine warmth. She knelt slightly, buckled the seatbelt with care, and gave the woman a reassuring smile before moving on. Jonathan nodded to himself. Progress. He glanced toward the front of the plane, where another flight attendant was assisting a passenger. With his luggage, no sighs, no impatience, just a willingness to help. Then, someone familiar stepped into view. Lisa Harper. She looked different. Not physically. Her uniform was still neatly pressed, her blonde hair still in a tight bun, but her posture, her demeanor, her entire presence, more purpose. She made eye contact with passengers. She smiled. Jonathan watched as she approached a young mother with a fussy baby. The woman looked tense, as if preparing for the same judgment she'd likely experienced before, but this time it never came. "Would you like a warm towel?" Lisa asked softly. "Sometimes the little ones like to hold on to them. It might help." The mother blinked, surprised. Then she smiled. "That would actually be really nice, thank you." Lisa returned the smile before moving on. Jonathan exhaled. Real change. As the plane continued boarding, Lisa finally spotted him. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment she froze. Then, instead of looking away, she straightened and walked toward him. "Mr. Carter," she said, stopping beside his row. There was no nervousness in her voice this time, just honesty. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Lisa, I know I can't undo what happened on that flight," she said, "but I want you to know I took the retraining seriously. I see things differently now." Jonathan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I can see that." Lisa hesitated, then extended a hand. "Thank you for holding me accountable." He shook it. "Thank you for choosing to change." She nodded once before moving on. The plane doors closed. The engines roared to life. As they lifted off, Jonathan looked out the window and smiled. Sometimes the best way to see the truth is to sit in a different seat.